Hello, dear audience. We are together again, and I'm very happy to be with you and to introduce our next topic. And we're also very happy to have our dear guest again with us, Dr. Kyriaki Fitzgerald. And I want to introduce her one more time for those people who haven't watched the last two shows and they're just joining us. Dr. Kyriaki is a theologian. She is a psychologist, and her office is in Sandwich, Massachusetts. She is a wonderful teacher. She teaches at Holy Cross Greek Orthodox Graduate School of Theology. She is a representative of the Orthodox Church for the World Council of Churches and in many other venues. She is the establisher and coordinator of St. Catherine's Vision. If you have any questions about any of those, you can contact her through the email that you see on the screen. She is an author and editor of many books. And most of all, I would like to introduce her from a different angle now. She's a wonderful presbytera. And Father Tom and her have served the Orthodox Church in many aspects and many levels. They have introduced the Orthodox Church to the Universal Church. Father Tom is also a teacher. He is one of the best theologians that I have had friendship with. Presbytera Kyriaki stands right next to him with all her virtues and God-given gifts. I would also like to explain what does presbytera mean. It's the Greek word for priest's wife, because as we know in the New Testament we meet several times presbyters were the priests, and in the Greek term for the priest's wife is the presbytera. And in some sense, all the presbyteras, all the priests' wives, and in Armenian it's yeretskin, yerets in Armenian means priest also, they share almost all the aspects of the priest's life, and they fulfill the priest in his mission. In this case, Father Tom and Dr. Kyriaki are not exception because they are successful or they have great knowledge of theology, but because what they are teaching they practice, and everything that comes out in their mission is practiced in their life. And this is why I also have her as a guest of this show, because I want this 1 hour to be a time that we speak about a real life. We speak about not things that are written in the books, but what we experience in our lives, what we go through, what we prove that is right by our own lives. This is done completely out of unconditional love. Dr. Kyriaki drives over 70 miles every Wednesday when she comes here for just only one reason, and that's the love of service that she has expressed in many ways, and this is one of them. And after all, our Lord Jesus Christ says, the greatest of you is the one who serves the rest of you. And to prove this point, he bent down and washed the feet of his disciples to show that this is the way to become great, to bend down, to humble ourselves and serve the rest of the humanity. Now, coming to the main topic, today we decided to speak about Providence, which naturally comes out of the last topics. And last topics were about the human being that is created by the image and after the likeness of God. And the second one was about hearts that are longing for God. This human being who has been created by the image of God cannot live without the origin, that he or she is the depiction, and that human being that is created by image of God is looking for that image in God. And so today we decided to speak about the providence because our lives sometimes can get confusing, can get very hard. And so we have to find answers. Why do these things happen? Where from comes the causes of these things that are happening to us and to the rest of the humanity. This topic has been object of long discussions. This type of discussions start from the very early moments of the seminary life, and they go all the way through the theological life of the priest, or they are always present into the lives of the believers. Why do these things happen? And there is one word for that: providence. And also I would like to mention that before the word providence, there were other terms to explain things like this. For example, luck or destiny. And I would like to speak about the differences between those terms also, because there is a distinct difference. But we don't promise to give a full explanation to all questions, because after all, as you will see soon, we are speaking about God's will. If we believe in God, we will see that the providence associates with God's will. And as we find in the Lord's Prayer, in the end, all we can say is God's will be done. So we are talking about God's will. Dr. Kyriaki, would you explain the word providence and how important it is for our audience to hear about this? Why did we choose this topic from your perspective?
I think providence is a very important and under-considered teaching within the Christian family today. We talk a little bit about it. If you Google the term Providence, or you'll get lots about Providence, Rhode Island, by the way. But if you Google on the internet a search for the providence of God, you'll get a rather interesting range of articles and websites of various persons struggling with the theology or explaining what does this term mean. Eastern Christianity has had a very developed and subtle understanding of this term. And up until, I'd say, the late Middle Ages, around the fall of Constantinople, the theology of providence was more discussed, was more well known within the life of the everyday Christian. Nowadays, I don't see it happening as being taught or discussed as much, and so that's why I thought it might be good for us to talk a little bit about this. We're not going to have all the answers now. What I hope happens now is that you and I can discuss some introductory aspects of what providence is and start a discussion between ourselves and with the persons at home to consider what this means for them. The word providence in Latin derives from the Latin term providere, which means to foresee. And in Greek, the word for providence, which appears only a couple of times in the New Testament per se, but it's described in other ways frequently within the New Testament, is the word pronia, meaning forethought, or what the mind has thought through beforehand, referring God's mind. And providence has 3 or 4 important dimensions to consider. One is that providence is that points to how much God cares about us as human beings and us as parts of His creation. So God cares. God established the creation because He cares. God preserves the creation even now because He cares. That's all part of providence. God directs, even controls creation because He cares and loves us. And fourth, He is directing history because He cares and loves us. And He is leading all of history back to Himself, all of creation back to Himself. That's what, in a nutshell, we believe. The foundation to this is that God cares about us, God loves us. That's important because oftentimes when people think of providence, they might think more in terms of predestination. Things are rigged, rigged in a good way for someone's benefit, which also means rigged in a bad way for other people's benefit. And why bother? Yes. When one says why bother, it means I don't care. I'm cutting myself off from life. And so that's not the fundamental meaning of providence. The providence is, the more we think about it, it's an invitation for us to trust God, the loving God within the actions of history that the Bible, to which the Bible and church history bears witness, and even in our own lives. Sometimes we can see this in large events. Sometimes we'll see this in small events, usually in hindsight. We don't know in the moment, gee, is this providence? Why? Because this is all mysteriously connected to the will and love of God. And I don't know God's will. I was saying to you a few minutes ago before we started, God did not send me an email about how He plans to direct the universe. But the Church's teaching, ancient teaching about providence, invites us to trust God's absolute love for all of us in a way that also respects our freedom absolutely.
You mentioned a little bit about predestination. Would you make it clear the difference between luck, destiny, and providence differences? When we say luck, what do we understand? Irreversible something, or when we say destiny, it's irreversible or not?
These are different concepts that we use as people to explain unexplainable things. Either for good, you can have good luck or bad luck, or even predestined. You know, my destiny has always been bad, has always been negative. Everything keeps falling apart on me. And yes, there are places in the world, there are places in this country, in our neighborhoods, maybe within our own families and homes, where bad is occurring. And it may or may not have direct input from the person experiencing the bad. Sometimes there is, sometimes there isn't. That does not take us outside of being in the center of the palm of God's loving hand. And I think when we think in terms of destiny, that concept distracts us from the love of God. Even when we think of luck, and I'll say good luck to people, or my own self, gee, I was lucky today. And I mean that, you know, I mean that lightly. But when I think about it more deeply, I really don't mean it in a deep way, because to say luck means there is no loving God. I can take it that far. Maybe other people won't, but I can take it that far. And so to think about the providence of God is to hold in two hands, one, that a sparrow does not fall to the ground, the hairs on our very heads are numbered, that God, we are all brought forth into this world for a purpose. What that is, I don't know. That's only known in the mind and heart of God. And to trust that, like little children, to trust that completely. And on the other hand, like adult, wise persons, to realize that we have free will and we are invited to use that maturely, wisely, and God respects our free will unconditionally. So these two dynamics, the respect of free will and the reality that everything occurs within the presence of the love of God, even if we reject the love of God, are both true at the same time. And yes, intellectually, philosophically, and logically, in a linear way that doesn't make any sense. At the same time, we're trying to, in our discussion today, to point to a mystery of something that Christianity has been bearing witness to in a quiet way for a very long time, so that people of goodwill can be more receptive to that and trust that, and hopefully have their lives benefit from that.
So what I understood from this is that when we say providence, we have three aspects: God's will, our own input to it, And then we also are doing things according what has been planned, but in the meantime we have freedom. What do we choose to do?
And I think that's good. And we have to relax, though. Relax in the sense of not to be lackadaisical, but to trust God being active every moment in our lives, even when we don't feel it, especially when we don't feel it. And that somehow we are being led, or we will stumble through, which might feel on our end we're stumbling through, but somehow we're being led through to the other side of some kind of difficult situation. By staying relaxed, I'm thinking, for example, the little line that St. Paul was wondering if an event was reflective of the will of God or not. Was this part of reflecting the providence of God in his life in that moment? And he used the Greek word tachas, which means perhaps. which is great, because I'm thinking, here's the great Paul, the great St. Paul, on fire for God, being enlivened by God, preaching the good news, taking great risks, and still says, maybe this is tachas, maybe this is reflecting God's will. We don't know sometimes till much later if something is, how God was active in that moment. And so he did not obsess, is this of God, is that of God, because then we can't live our lives.
Yes.
If we're obsessing every moment, is this God's will, is that God's will, then we're kind of imprisoning ourselves to a fake concept of God being sort of a judge and jury and executioner, waiting that we make the wrong choice, and by making the wrong choice, we wind up losing. Kind of like those game shows where there's curtain number 1, curtain number 2, curtain number 3. And if we don't choose the right curtain, which is God's will, then we're going to get curtain number whatever, and each one has a booby trap. We'll get eaten by a lion or eaten by a tiger. And so that's not what the real God has in store for us. Lions and tigers are out there. But it's because of lots of other factors, because of God's infinite love that we don't understand, who respects free will, absolutely, that, lions and tigers and bears, oh my, are out there that may not have goodwill for other human beings. So the word that comes from the Eastern Greek tradition, spiritual tradition, about how does one stay mindful and relaxed about being in the presence of God, is the word nipsis, or nepsis, depending on how you pronounce it. And you spell that Nepsis in English. And nepsis is that, the Buddhists have a similar word about mindfulness or wakefulness. It's similar. But for nepsis, our mindfulness, our wakefulness is more personal and interrelational, in that we are present and relaxed and allowing ourselves to be held in the palm of God's hand as we peacefully look at our lives, as we peacefully discern what's happening, or make a decision, or act or not act. Nepsis or nipsis is that discerning, but it's peaceful, we're awake, but it's not anxious. It's a lovely term of relaxed, but not sloppy, but relaxed, trusting wakefulness as we discern how we proceed. How do we trust? And so when we trust God, then, there are several ways we express that trust. Number one, we receive. We receive all the information that God is allowing us to receive in that moment. Sometimes we don't want to hear everything. Sometimes we want to hear parts of it. I think if we trust God, then we ask, with God's help, to learn everything we're supposed to learn about a certain situation. Not to be in denial about certain things, either within our own selves or in relationship with other people. Sometimes we have relationships that are healthy with other people. Sometimes we're in a relationship with other people that's toxic and poisonous and very unhealthy for us. And so to receive that information, to receive all of the data in the presence of the loving God with an open mind and heart. Then when we receive that, we reflect on that. All right? After we reflect on that, how do we reflect on it? Do we ponder it deeply? Do we think about the possible scenario about which we're accountable? Or do we just consider certain things and just stay open? Because sometimes we can't make a decision for a while. We just have to ponder what we can and then leave the rest to be addressed later, and be open-ended in the presence of God. And that's very hard to do in this society where we want everything now.
Yes.
And then there comes a time when we act. And then we either reach out for help, or reach out to help others, or we respond in some other way, or maybe our action is to wait somewhere.
You mentioned about the Buddhist term. I heard one philosopher speaking and comparing two cultures, the Eastern and Western cultures. And he said that both these two cultures have different approach to life. The Eastern think that everything is predestined, everything is decided, and everything is based what we have created in the past, and also we have many choices in terms of many lives. And they lay back because they have endless choices, endless lives, and the West has one life, everything they decide here and now, and they both suffer because, like we see in India, people are so poor, so in bad condition, and they're suffering, and because this person was explaining that's because of this mindset that there is endless opportunity in the future. And in the West, there is a rush. We have to do it right away now, otherwise we're going to miss the chance. Do you think that the Eastern Christian approach is in between those two in terms of providence, that yes, it is predestined, but we have a choice. We can do it now, we can do it later, we can leave it for God's decision?
That's a good question. You're not the first person to say there are historians, cultural historians, that say Eastern Christianity, by its very geography, is in a great location to be able to benefit from the currents of thought and philosophies that have occurred to the east, to the west, to the north, and to the south. And so I think a lot of people would say, from the West especially, that in some ways Eastern Christianity has insight that is shared by other people from that region, that geographical region. And we don't know, from an Orthodox perspective, an Orthodox Christian perspective, how God is active in those other cultures. Yeah. We don't know, and that's a sign of respect and love to the loving God, how God is engaging with those people in ways that I don't know, because I'm not part of that community. Yeah. At the same time, I know a little bit more about my own community, and just a little bit more. What I've come to appreciate is that the radical respect for free will within the general context of the trusting the love of God, that God cares, that God is directing history, that God is active through history, while we also are active in our own lives. Remembering the story of Jesus conducting his first miracle, and it was at the wedding of Cana, and that the bride and groom ran out of wine. The celebration was coming to a screeching halt because all the wine was gone, and his mother Mary went to the Lord and said, "They have no wine," and looks at him. and he says, "Woman, it is not my time yet."
Yes.
And that's beautiful. That does, in a sense, reflect that Jesus had a sense of God's providence and how his life was unfolding. And here she comes, sort of, from her free will, throwing a monkey wrench into his plans. And so what does he do? He changes history and turns the water into wine, and not only wine, but the best wine, which says something really wonderful about God from another angle, about God's generosity and love for us. At the same time, that still fit. Somehow, in God's providence, that still fits within God's mind what He has in mind for all of creation, which is to, in the end, all of creation, all of us, to be one with Him, God being all in all.
Mm-hmm.
Now that's a heavy theological teaching that maybe we can talk about sometime, not now, but that is, in a sense, why we have to talk about providence. That there is, because God's love is so much for each one of us, all the persons within creation and all His creation, that He desires us all to be one with Him and one another. And that is another reason why it's important to talk about providence. As painful as life can sometimes be for all of us, I don't want to say sometimes for some of us, if we live long enough, life will be painful for some reason.
Because we started talking about Christ and Mary and the providence in their life, I would like to speak about prophecy a little bit. Do you think that prophecy is one of the ways of letting people know what God's plan is for them?
Mm-hmm.
And why is it given to only few people, only the prophets? Why don't everybody know
Mm-hmm.
about God's plan, what's going to happen to their own life, to the life of the planet? Now we're very worried about the planet Earth, that we're running out of water, the air is polluted, the oceans are polluted, everything is going out of our hands, and we don't know what's going to happen. But maybe there is a prophecy about it. Maybe Christ's prophecy is coming to be fulfilled when He says the sun will rise from all corners of the earth. I mean, 4 corners of the earth. And scientifically, we don't know what does that mean. And would you speak about the prophecy a little bit as a form of providence? How does that work?
Prophecy points to the providence of God. That's a great way to put it.
Mm-hmm.
Because when one thinks about prophecy in our culture, we have to be careful. Many people think of prophecy as fortune telling, prophesying some distant event or something that's destined to happen, and it's often a kind of prediction that makes me wonder, who's getting secondary gain? Who, the prophet? What is the prophet, a real prophet or not a real prophet?
Mm-hmm.
And so, prophecy from the Eastern Christian perspective, especially, points to the providence of God, points to the will of God in a specific context at a specific time. So, a lot of the time, to prophesy is not to predict the future.
Okay.
A lot of the time, to prophesy is to say the will of God in that moment.
Wow, interesting.
Okay? And sometimes it is seeing the future, but it's always about related. You're very right to connect this with the providence of God. It's always pointing to the providence of God. And usually, the person making the prophecy does not have any immediate secondary gain coming from that, unless it's God's will to bless him or her because of whatever trials they're going through that will lead to something better for them. There are many false prophets today. Mm-hmm. There were many false prophets in the past. And so it's important to bear in mind when people are making prophecies to be discerning. What is this authentic? Is this bearing witness to the love of God in the moment, or not?
Mm-hmm. That was a good point, because we know that many, I don't want to call them churches, but many groups have suffered from this, that the end of the time has come, is upon us, and they have burned themselves in the church or things like that, which kind of is against God's will, I would say so.
I have a hard time with people who, forgive me, and forgive me everyone, I have a hard time with people who are making it a big deal to talk about the end of the world, or the end times, or the end times are coming, or the Antichrist. The Antichrist might be here. We hear these things. People have talked about these things when they read Scripture. And I'm thinking, why are we paying such an obsession amount of attention to this? I'm not saying don't study what this might what the scriptures might say about this. How does this fit in with the larger life of the Christian church? And how does the Christian church understand this? That's a different issue. But I find personally, why are we concerned about the end time when my end time is coming up? My end time could be today, or it could be in 50 years. But why? I find it ironic that we talk about the end times, and none of us, when we start getting off on these long discussions and concepts and theologizing, we aren't being serious about, gee, our days are numbered, our personal days. My number's going to come up. Will it be the end of the world? Part of me doesn't really care. Why? Because it's my world ending, you know. But that should make me more alive to what is my mission. Now, I don't know what my mission is. I have to keep showing up. You've heard me say this before in our friendship and here with the folks who might be watching. Our mission is something that is only known best in the heart and mind of God. Our identities, who we are only known best in the mind and heart of God. We just have to show up and keep becoming the persons we're called to be, whoever that is. And so life, somehow, through the providence of God, through the pain of life, through the gifts of life, if we show up and in a trustful way make choices that bear witness to this loving God, somehow helps give God more ability to work within us to help us become more who we're called to be and to do the work we're called to do.
Now we went to the more global understanding of it, but I want to bring it back to the personal, to the human life, because that's what matters. What difference does our will make? We say that the providence is God's plan, God's will, and everything is according to what He chose to be for us. What part of that is our own will? How can we change it? Bad or good direction?
If I understand you correctly, I think it's cultivating an open mind and heart, a loving mind and a loving heart. God wants to be with us. And the more we strive to love Him and one another, the more God's will somehow occurs in a mysterious way. Your questions point to the mystery of how God operates. I don't know how He's operating. Remember, St. Paul said, tachas, maybe, perhaps God's working this way, perhaps He's working that way. And it's good to keep a tachas, to keep a, maybe this, maybe that way, an open-handed, trusting, childlike openness to God. In a way, as a psychologist, when I'm saying these terms, I'm thinking, oh my gosh, I think one of the things I'm pointing to is a kind of, and forgive me, the clinicians who may be watching this, a kind of infantilization, where we're, as adults, sort of turning over, surrendering our know-it-all positions, and turning it over to, like a child would, trusting mommy or daddy to be directed. Well, I think as a psychologist, most of the time that I've been trained about infantilization, it's unhealthy, it's abusive. And we have to be careful, especially if there are religious leaders out there that are demanding infantilization of us adults without the fruits of what they're claiming. And I think we have to be very careful. But in the spiritual life, there is something, and I'm making this up, but I'm pointing to a real phenomenon. You can tell me if you agree. In the healthy spiritual life, if we're growing in Christ, if we're growing in the Lord, that there is a kind of healthy or holy infantilization, where we, like children, surrender a lot of our grandiosity, surrender all of our grandiosity, our adult-sized grandiosity, over to God, and allow ourselves to be led in a new way. It's by doing that, we are and examining our hearts to be pure, in the sense of as sinless, as selfishless as possible in the presence of God, as we strive to love Him and one another and others more fully. This tells me maybe an easier way to remember this is that we are called to grow in innocence.
Okay.
All right? There's two types of innocence. The kind of innocence I'm talking about, where as adults we're called to grow in innocence. And that's kind of a heavy concept for those of us who think we're very smart and know-it-alls and sophisticated, by the way. Versus naivete. Naivete and innocence are not the same thing. Babies and little children are both innocent and naive. Mm-hmm. We as adults might be less naive. What's sad is we lose the innocence. And I think as Christians, one of the tools in growing in nepsis, as I said earlier, in the presence of God, is to cultivate losing the naivete, because we are living in a world that's filled with not so good things, be as wise as serpents and that's innocent right. as doves. Okay?
That's right.
We're called by Jesus to do. And as we lose the naivete, to cultivate growth in innocence. Now that's a tall order for us very sophisticated and highly educated people who get around. But it's a way of trusting, living more truthfully in our lives, and it gives God more room to work His love for us that way.
In this case, when we grow in innocence and God's plan works perfectly,
whatever that means for God, because
yes,
okay, whatever that means.
And
right. Forgive
actually, I remembered when you were explaining, I remembered a couple examples. When you spoke about Paul, we know how he ended up being an apostle. At first, he was persecuting Christians, but it seems like he didn't have a way out of it. He had to become an apostle. There was no other way. God forced him to become. Christ appeared to him and said, "Look, you have
knocked off his horse.
Yes,
like blinding light knocks him off his horse.
You have to do this." Like another example after that I remember was Jonah's example when he tried to escape from it. Run away. Go to the other direction. I don't want this.
And what happened to Jonas? Tell the audience what happened to Jonas. When he tried to run away, what happened?
He even threw himself into the ocean, but the whale took him out of the...
That's great.
Took him out to a place where he had to do it. So these are examples that show us we don't have a choice out of it.
Well, you're reminding me, you're pressing a few buttons in me. Let me just respond with one. And that is, as we grow as adults, if there might be issues or events or people or responsibilities thrust on us that we did not predict. Mm-hmm. Our life was going one way, and something happens to make it go another way. And in my own life, and I am not going to say what that is, but there have been a couple of occasions, especially one in particular, where I was running away for years from a particular type of thing. Mm-hmm. Running away, saying, "This is not for me. I'm not to be doing that." Mm-hmm. And the more I ran, the more I found events happening and life happening that kept me facing that. And so now I'm doing some of the things I used to swear up and down I would never do, which is kind of God's joke. I like to say God's a jokester, you know. But I'm finding, because I'm following through with this unwanted responsibility, or these unwanted mm-hmm. I'm asking God, even now, to say, okay, I still kind of don't want them, but I see the good that's happening. Change my heart so it's as if I wanted them from the beginning.
Yes.
Right? It's as if, I'm still not there with one of them especially, but to have that prayer is the beginning of that happening, I think, yes. Sometimes.
And on this point, what about the opposite?
Okay.
Some people want to get out of places. Drug users, alcoholics, criminals, and most of them, I feel, that know in their heart that this is not the right thing to do, but they cannot get out of it. Some people don't want to do the good thing, or whatever God has planned for them, a great thing, to become a great apostle, mm-hmm. or a preacher, or savior, or whatever, but God pulls them, forces them to become. And these people are in the mud, that they're stuck, that their life is a hell, a misery, and they want to get out of it, they can't. How do you explain that?
I can't explain every person's life, but with what I've seen in people's lives, first, acknowledging the desire to change things. Sometimes the desire doesn't come for a long time.
Okay.
Why? As we were saying earlier, sometimes we are pulled by distractions, or life happens and we make wrong choices and we're pulled by distractions through our free will and seductions, trying to find a quick source of relief, and that gets us deeper and deeper into more trouble as we're looking for relief. Now, God is a God of love. God knows how all of us feels from the inside out. So there are thousands and millions of people who've made some very bad choices that if we had a sense of their heart, we would realize that they were just seeking relief. And that by seeking relief, they may have been even looking for God, but didn't have the language for, and so would look more deeply into places that wound up being more abusive for them. So we cannot be, as you were, I think, as I was hearing you, you were painting with a broad brushstroke people who have addictions, people who are in the depths of depravity, people who are criminals. We don't know in their hearts what pain brought them to these places and what phenomena brought these to these places. And sometimes, paradoxically, some of the choices that brought them there were not bad. They were just trying to get out of pain's way or trying to get relief. Sometimes people were seeking excitement as a substitute God in order to cover up the emptiness. I mean, there's so many explanations that we can use that are true, that can give us a sense of how people lose their way. We can all lose our way. That's why I say this, me first, we can all lose our way. And so with each person, depending on the context in which they find themselves, it means, first would be to awaken and acknowledge that my life is unmanageable, that my life is completely, I'm powerless over whatever it is. And the Christian church, much like what some of the self-help groups have discovered, and other groups, is the only way through such muck and mire is to open up oneself to beyond oneself and reach out for help. And that means reaching out to God and also reaching out to other people who have some insight and wisdom into this. And so I'm sure many of us know examples of people who have turned, whose lives have in an astounding manner turned around as a result of opening themselves up in a new way to God and to the goodness in others. And they wind up becoming new human beings.
The great example, now I remember the thief next to Christ. We can say it is a providence. I mean, it is a providence in general. That's not a question. But we have two thieves. One starts swearing at Christ, and the other one says, "Don't do that because he is Son of God." And according to his response, he gets the gift of being with Christ. Now, is our participation how much is it important to participate? Like the thief who chose to say, "No, he is Son of God, don't do that," and the thief who didn't care, that, why don't you save me too with you?
Well, remember what the first thief who, when he was deriding Jesus, and he said, if you're the Son of God, call your angels from heaven and have them rescue you. Very cynical and looking down on him. He was God in that moment.
Okay.
He was God, judging Jesus. The other, in the last moment, noticed something was wrong in his own life. He noticed that somehow he had the miracle of the softening and awareness of his heart that this was an innocent man. And by being open to noticing the innocence of Jesus made him aware of the innocence he had lost.
Mm-hmm.
The second we realize the innocence we have lost, that opens us up to sorrow and pain, but also a reaching out for help, as any child would ask for help, to regain that. I mean, I don't think he would have said what he said if he wasn't reaching out to Jesus also, the second thief in that moment. And by reaching out, what did Jesus say? Our relationship is restored.
Mm-hmm.
You will be with me today in
Yes.
paradise.
The question about Judas. He did what he did. Christ told him to do whatever he's supposed to be doing. And he punished himself. And until now, in the Christian history or in the lives of the Christian people, he is the symbol of betrayal and the bad guy. But in some sense, he did what he was supposed to do. How do you explain, what do you think about this? How do you explain this phenomenon that Judas was a betrayer, he did the worst thing ever, but in a sense, Christ knew what's going to happen, who is going to do it. He told him to go do it, and yet he said, woe to the person who will do it. It would be better if he wasn't born than he was born and did this.
Well, I don't know what that means, the part about it would be better that he wasn't born.
Mm-hmm.
I have some ideas, but they're still in formulation. But the Garden of Gethsemane scene that you're describing, in a sense, typifies God's stance toward us
Mm-hmm.
through God's providence. That Jesus knew, all his friends, his disciples, those that became the apostles, were acting out of free will and what was in their hearts. And Judas, especially toward the end, was sort of giving signs. There's a story soon before the Gethsemane scene where they're in someone's house for supper and they were being entertained by him, and a woman comes in with a large jar of nard and ointment, very costly materials in those days, and she washes, out of her humility, love, and gratitude, Jesus' feet
Mm-hmm.
with her tears and with this expensive ointment. And Judas says, why is she doing this? Why did she spend all this money on this material when that could have been given to the poor?
Mm-hmm.
Well, that was a smart alecky, evil-hearted thing to say. What he was trying to do, he had his reward. He was justifying himself. He was being self-righteous. He was trying to make points about how, and trying to look good with the people in the room by putting her down, saying this money could have been given to the poor. And so he's an agent for the poor. And so you get a sense of his mixed motivations that
Mm-hmm.
were self-serving. And so Jesus in Gethsemane, I think when he said, go do what you have to do, he wasn't commanding him. He was in agony over all of the betrayals, but especially the betrayal of a friend who was coming in with self-serving purposes.
Mm-hmm.
And so, in a sense, when we make choices that are ultimately self-serving, we are cutting God out.
Yeah.
When we cut God out, we are cutting out the author of life.
Yes.
And so, what does that mean when we cut the author of life out of our lives? And that doesn't mean, I don't know what that means for everyone. I mean, if I've said in the past, my hope as a Christian is that people keep seeking the truth, because truth for me is a person.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe not for other people, but for me, truth is a person. And so that will help with finding and experiencing and growing in more life for them.
I believe, I have felt several times that there is Judas in me, and there is in every human being in different times of the life. We feel that betray our own or God's principles several times, and we become the part of the betrayal.
You're talking about self-service, self-serving motivations, the selfish and self-serving motivations of Judas. It was all about him. He was trying to look good at that dinner that I had said a few minutes ago, that he was trying to score points in many, many ways. And so his mind and heart were very, very far from Jesus.
Yeah.
His mind and heart were very, very far from growing in the truth. He kind of came, perhaps, I don't know what his motivations were, but oftentimes in my experience when people join groups with that kind of orientation, they're not really going to support a group or grow and benefit spiritually from the group and be of service. They kind of have other ideas in mind that are self-serving, and it's them being on top and having power in some way. And so this dynamic of self-service with that dark part within us, maybe that might be the next conversation we have, is the dark parts in us, the part of us that sin, the part of us that do evil, the part of us that are self-seeking. And that's a long discussion, but
Yes.
maybe that's where we have to go next time.
Yes, we certainly should. And now when you started explaining, I can more clarify what I wanted to know is if we feel the same way that Judas felt, he regretted what he did for, and he wanted to find a way back. But because his mind was somewhere else, again, in his regret, in his ways of trying to go back, he chose the wrong way. He went to the wrong way. And he was blamed for it too. And now the ultimate question is when there are people like this who fell off the trucks, become addicts or criminals.
May I just say, it's not the same. Don't equate the fall of Judas with addicts and people who have fallen off the truck in other ways. We don't know. We don't know. I see the concern you have. That's why you're saying that. So I respect your concern and wanting to find an answer. But the answer is going to be there's various answers for various people, and so especially because of my work with people who have suffered through addictions and have suffered through various types of traumas and have made choices, some to their benefit, some not to their benefit. It's important to sort of keep them a little bit apart. That all of us, from Judas to you and me to everybody in every truck, can we fall into the sin of self-service? Absolutely. So maybe that's what we have to think about. If you're open to this, if you want to invite me back, to talk more about maybe personal sin or the sin of self-service. Maybe that might be more specific. Or self-seeking. We can call it pride. We can think about this in the next couple of weeks, but maybe this is the direction we should go in.
All right, our time is out. We can endlessly discuss this and even go to different directions and find new ways, new aspects of the same thing. And it's endless, like the universe, like God Himself. And I want to thank you for your time and for your service, your energy. And thank you, dear audience, for being with us, because your participation is very important. And I want to mention that we got one official email to the studio thanking for the program. And that's very refreshing and very important for us also, because sometimes you need a little motivation to do better, to become better and do more that you are intended to do. Thank you very much again, and we'll meet next time. We'll try to continue and go into more details of same or similar topics and clarify little aspects of our lives to be a little bit helpful in a spiritual journey, because it's very dangerous and it's very difficult. I have found in my own life that it's difficult if you don't have a guide, if you don't have light in front of you that you can follow. the lighthouse or something. It seems like in the ocean. You don't know where to go, which direction to choose, unless you settle down and start listening to your own heart and find the right guide. Thank you very much again. Thank you, Presbytera, for your presence and for your explanations, and hopefully we'll have many more.
Thank you.
Have a good day.